Hi class, welcome to week 2 of our summer session. I hope that you had a good week and that you found my lecture helpful. I'm currently going through your assignments that will have them graded as soon as possible, but I wanted to do a couple of things in this video. One, I wanted to go over the guidelines for our communication theory paper, and I also wanted to discuss obviously the chapters that we will be covering for the week. So let me get started by quickly going over the guidelines of the paper, getting that out of the way, and then I'll continue with this week's lecture. So, as you all know, we do have a paper coming up. It is due next week. It is the communication theory paper, and you also will be taking the midterm next week. But for right now, we're just going to be focusing on the communication theory paper. The guidelines of the paper are at the very bottom. And basically for this paper, what I want you to do is I want you to pick a theory from the list that I have provided for you, which I'll show you in a second. So pick one of the theories that are provided on the list, and you will be researching that theory, and you will be answering the following questions through your research. So basically, once you have picked out a theory from the list, and one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that once you have a classmate has already picked theory, you're not allowed to pick it again. There are 26 theories that I have up on my Canvas page, and there are 26 of you in this class. So there should not be any repeats. So if you have any questions as to who already took what theory, you will see discussion post number 4, which is where everybody is submitting their topic approval. You'll be able to see who has chosen what. So before you have your mindset on a particular theory, I will highly encourage you to go check on discussion post number 4 to see if anybody has already chosen that theory, so that you don't waste your time and you can move on to another one. But basically, once you have chosen a theory and you have made sure that nobody else has chosen it, you will be looking at the following things. First, you will be looking at who are the scholars and the theories, when the theorists who came up with the theory, what field did they come from, what was their area of research, just basically giving us a good background on the scholars. A lot of scholars in communication studies come from different fields. We have some scholars that are anthropologists, linguists, some of them who are psychologists and all of that. Communication studies is one of those disciplines that kind of borrows from different disciplines. So tell us where they come from, what were they researching, what was their area of researching, and all of that. Question number 2, how did they come across the theory? So basically, how did they stumble upon it? Were they running a study? Were they observing people? And this week we actually will be talking about the research paradigms in communication theory. So I will be going over that on our lecture. And you will basically be looking at which one of those paradigms these scholars fell into. Question number 3, how does the theory apply or work in real life communication setting? A lot of the communication theories, we want to make sure that, you know, they're not just a theory, that we can actually see it applicable in a communication setting. So I want you to make that connection. So basically, if you were to take this theory and apply it to something that has happened either in your personal life or a fictional character in a film or in a book, use that example to illustrate how that theory comes to life. And lastly, why is the theory important to communication studies? You can use your opinion and your research to kind of like back that up. Obviously, like I mentioned, a lot of these theories come from different fields like anthropology, psychology, sociology. So obviously these come from other fields, but why are they relevant and why are they studied in communication studies? So those are the 4 questions that you will be answering in your paper. Your paper is 3 to 5 pages in length, double spaced, 12-point font, Times New Roman with 1-inch margins. When I mean 3 to 5 pages in length, I mean actually 3 full pages, double spaced, such that the 3rd page is completed all the way to the bottom. 2 pages and a paragraph is not 3 pages, that is 2 pages and a paragraph. So make sure that you actually complete the bottom of the 3rd page. You are going to be doing research on this theory. Your textbook is not support for this research. There are a couple of theories that are part of the list that I have created online that are found on our textbook, but your textbook is not a source of research. You have to use outside sources to back up your research. Obviously, I expect you to have at least 3 sources to back up your paper, if not more, but you need at least 3 sources. And basically, no Wikipedia, Make sure that you find reliable sources. The SMC library database has tons of great sources. It has a great database in which you can pretty much find scholarly articles that will be helpful for you to do your research. So that's the guidelines for the paper. Now I want to go over basically what the theories are. So the list of communication theories are right here. Like I mentioned to you all before, there are 26 of them that I have listed over here. And like I said, you will choose one that has not already been chosen by somebody else. So I highly encourage you to choose your theory sooner rather than later, because the most popular ones get picked really fast. So make sure that you look them over, do a quick Google search to make sure that that's something that you're interested in. And as soon as you have that, your mind set onto it, go on discussion post number 4, make sure that nobody else has picked it and choose it. All of these theories are really interesting. So basically any of these will be great to look at. It's just basically a preference, but don't wait until the last minute to choose, because you might end up with something that you don't feel interested about. So like I keep mentioning discussion post number 4, which is right here. For this discussion post, you're actually going to be letting me know which theory you have chosen. Again, make sure that nobody else in the class has already chosen that theory, otherwise you will be wasting your time. So look at all the theories, see that nobody has chosen it, and once you are sure that nobody else has picked it, answer the following questions. Basically, what is the theory? Who are the scholars? Just basically giving me a little bit of background to know that you're actually going in the right direction. With that being said, you have 2 quizzes and you have 2 discussion posts this week. And they're going to be based on the chapters that are meant to be discussed for this week, which are chapter 6, 8, and 9. And obviously you have to complete all of this work by Friday at 11:59 p.m. And if you have any questions, just let me know. But basically, this is what I want you to focus on. Again, the paper is not due this week, it's due at the end of next week. But I'm giving you the guidelines and all of that already so that we can get our topic approval out of the way, so that next week, the only thing that you have to worry about is submitting your paper and taking your midterm exam as well. So let's get started with today's lecture. So for today's lecture, like I said, we are going to be covering chapters 6, 8, and 9, which talk about listening, communication theory, and interpersonal communication. So basically, we are going to be focusing on the following objectives on this mini lecture. So by the end of the lesson, you should be able to list the steps of the listening process. You should also be able to identify the different paradigms of communication. Like I mentioned to you all when I was going over the guidelines for the paper, you are going to have to identify which paradigm the theory does fit into, or the research or the study that they use to develop the theory, what paradigm it fits into. You're also going to be defining interpersonal communication. And finally, you're going to be discussing self-disclosure and what it is. So these are the areas that I'm going to be focusing on in this lecture. Obviously, the chapters on the textbook cover so much more than that. And in your quizzes, I will be asking questions in regards to the reading, not only necessarily what I cover in these guidelines. So it is required and it is expected of you to do all of your readings, not only listen to just my mini lecture. Let's get started. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is that often as just as students or scholars in the communication studies discipline, we want to focus on how messages are transmitted from one person to the next. And our main focus of it is just how does information get exchanged? But one of the big areas that we forget to consider is that listening is a big part of communication. If you're not listening, the message gets distorted. If you're not listening, you're not giving appropriate feedback in the conversation. So listening is important to the communication process. If you look back at our lecture from last week when we talk about the communication model, listening is a key factor in the process of giving feedback and kind of like exchanging that message and just basically making communication that transactional process. So listening is important, but listening is not something that happens naturally. Listening requires focus. So the difference between listening and hearing is that hearing is a physiological process. It happens all the time. It is automatic. It's not something that you can really control. Listening, on the other hand, is something that you control, is something that is active and that you have to choose to focus on. So the listening process is a set of steps. that are not necessarily linear, meaning that they go in sequential order. Sometimes in the listening process, you can combine sometimes certain steps get combined, sometimes certain steps get skipped, but it's still a process that we follow. The first step of the listening, like I said, listening doesn't happen in a lot of linear manners. It can happen, where two steps are combined into one. Sometimes we tend to skip a step. Sometimes the steps can get out of order. But it does happen, but we do have these steps in the listening process. So the first step is receiving. Like I mentioned to you before, this is kind of like more characterized by hearing. So when you are at a particular place, you're often bombarded by different sounds. So that is a physiological process. Sounds are bombarding us all the time. But when we choose to focus on a particular sound, that's when we are listening. So in the receiving stage, you kind of sift through all of the sounds that are happening in the background, and you choose one to focus on. Then we move on to the following step, which is interpreting, where you're trying to make meaning out of the message. So for example, let's say that a friend is getting your attention. They finally got your attention and they're telling you about their day. This is how you're kind of piecing together the story that they're telling you, making sense of the information you are receiving. So that's the second step. The third step is recalling. One of the main disagreements that scholars in communication studies have when it comes to listening is the importance of recalling or remembering in the listening process. There are some scholars that would tell you that if you're not able to remember information, it's because the listening process didn't occur or that you weren't really listening. Other scholars would say that, a lot of it is dependent on your memory. Depending on how good your memory is, that's how much you are able to recall or how well you are able to recall. So again, when it comes to this, the jury is still out, but we have to keep in mind that still recalling and being to remember somehow or somewhat the information or at least the conversation that you had is important to the listening process. I'm not saying that it is vital or it's the one thing that makes or breaks the listening process, but it's still very important. The fourth step is evaluating. This is when you are critiquing the message. So basically, if you've ever had somebody tell you a story and you're trying to kind of follow along the story and you're trying to kind of decipher whether the story makes sense, whether the person is being truthful, whether, you have had a similar experience, or when you're trying to figure out how to respond or how to what to think of the message, that's the evaluating process of it. Lastly is the responding step, when you basically offer when you send feedback or you send a message to the other party, letting them know that you have listened to their message. This can be verbal or nonverbal. Sometimes we quickly nod or keep the eye contact with the other person, and that's sufficient to let them know that we have received and we're listening to their message. Sometimes you have to do verbal cues, for example, like yes, I understand, or respond in some way. And that will, so the responding phase of the listening process can be both verbal and nonverbal. So again, there are many barriers to listening as well. We are not perfect listeners, and the textbook does a really good job at showing you different things that get in the way of listening. Sometimes our own biases, our own preferences, or prejudice get in the way of the listening process. But it is really important to practice the active listening to make sure that we're following along, that we're focusing on the information, that we are keeping eye contact. It's really important to practice active listening because it's not something that happens naturally. It's something that needs to be practiced. So I highly encourage you to think about how listening is important in your daily communication, and think of times where listening hasn't worked out the best way for you and what were the consequences of it. So again, make sure that you're reading the entire chapter so that you get an idea of what are some other things that get in the way of listening and what we can do to become better listeners. So next I wanted to move on to chapter 8, which kind of focuses on communication theory. So our first main assignment for this class, which is the communication theory paper, is basically the paper that highlights the importance of communication theory. And a lot of people, when we often mention the word theory, they get confused, or it reminds them of math or science, right? Because when we often think of a theory, we think of like some mathematical, geometrical problem we have to solve, or in science where you're trying to prove something is a theory, right, through the scientific process. But in communications, we do have theories that we have proven, and there are different ways in which those theories have been proven, which are the different paradigms. And in this part of the lecture, I'm going to be discussing the different paradigms that are talked about in the communication studies discipline, and basically what each of them stand for and their strengths and weaknesses. I want to make sure that you remember that in your communication theory paper, you're going to be evaluating the theory through the research that you do, and you are going to be deciding into which paradigm they fit into. So pay close attention to what I'm going to discuss right now. So the first paradigm is empirical laws. And basically this paradigm says that, there are certain laws that, control every single human communication interaction. So these are laws that we have to follow, that are never broken, that are 100% certain. Not 100% certain, but that are more certain than not. And they basically predict future behavior. So when you see a lot of communication scholars who do a lot of kind of like quantitative research and when I refer to quantitative research, I refer to kind of like numbers, percentages, and things like that. This type of research is often characterized by surveys and by questionnaires and things like that, where they want to kind of like predict what percentage or what statistic of people fits into that. It's more of a numerical way of kind of like predicting behavior. And, there are a lot of scholars in different fields of communication studies that kind of fall into this type of paradigm. So I know that from my graduate school experience, a lot of the professors that I had who did research in interpersonal communication or communication theory, or even some aspects of intercultural communication, some aspects, not all of them. A lot of these scholars were more of like the empirical law paradigm, because they used a lot of surveys, a lot of questionnaires, and they would predict like certain patterns and statistics and all of that. And, the strength in that is that obviously, because it is more of like a scientific method, because it is more of a control method, it allows you to make predictions, create those cause and effect relationships. Because usually when we look at numbers, when we look at statistics, usually they are more hard evidence, and they usually are more certain than not. But the problem with that is that it kind of oversimplifies the process of communication studies. So like we talked about in the beginning, a lot of communications scholars try to define the communication process in kind of like a linear, very strict way, but they ignore certain aspects of communication that play a role in the way that the message is received. And that's why we kind of moved from that linear method to more of the transactional method, because there are other areas of communication that we have to take into consideration. So that's one of the weaknesses of this empirical laws paradigm. The fact that, yes, you want to predict the behavior, but by focusing on like these small predictions and these small causes and effects, you ignore other areas that might also be contributing to this communicative process. The second paradigm is the human rules paradigm. And this is similarly to the empirical laws, but a little bit different. And the reason is that rules are different from laws. A rule is something that is created by a society and that it can be broken. Usually when we have a law, there's usually large consequences when you break that law. So think about it. If you are speeding or you're driving under the influence, obviously there is a big consequence for breaking that law. In a rule, I mean, rules are meant to be broken, like the saying says. So when we talk about the human rules paradigm, we're saying kind of like focusing on different contexts. Every context, every society, every group of people has a different set of rules depending on the context that they grew up in. One of the things that a lot of this human rules paradigm kind of like focuses or falls into is a lot of like observation. So a lot of intercultural communication scholars do what is known as an ethnography. And ethnography is basically when a scholar goes and kind of observes or takes part of a cultural practice or a cultural group, and then they kind of observe their behavior and they write their experience, right? And the benefit of having this paradigm is that they kind of account for choice. They kind of see that, yes, you know, there are certain rules, but obviously a person can break those rules, make up their own rules, and they kind of look at context when it comes to that. One of the weaknesses is that because it's focusing on rules, and rules can be broken and rules can be changing, and there is, you know, that kind of like agency and choice of the individual. Obviously, it's really hard to predict behavior, because if anything can be broken, if anything can be changed by an individual, how much can you predict that behavior? Obviously, there are the benefits to it. Like I mentioned, a lot of intercultural communication scholars kind of like looked and observed the behavior of a particular culture, and then they're able to kind of like explain to us what that culture is like. And it shows us how, you know, in that particular setting with that particular culture, things work out a particular way. So that's the second paradigm. The third paradigm is called the systems theory paradigm. And this is basically one that looks at basically how all behaviors in the communication studies field are kind of connected to one another and what those connections mean. So for example, the best example that we can think of when it comes to the systems theory paradigm is global warming. So when we think about global warming was not caused only by one thing. Global warming was caused by multiple things, right? And it kind of shows how like all of these things kind of created that domino effect, that one thing led to the other and led to the next, which created this whole global warming situation that we're in. That's what the system paradigm says. It says that one thing led to another, which leads to another thing, which create the phenomenon that we're looking at. One of the greatest things about the systems theory paradigm is that basically it creates a bigger picture. It shows us how very different parts, very different individuals, very different behaviors kind of create this whole bigger situation, which gives us the bigger picture of what's going on. One of the weaknesses is that it is too broad. Usually in research, you want to be able to focus on a couple of things so that we can do thorough research. And this one says, no, we have to look at the entire picture. We have to look at this whole thing. So the focus is too broad, might not be specific enough to give us one particular theory to define a method. But again, it is helpful because it does create a bigger picture. It shows us how like one thing leads to the next. Again, the best way to think about the systems theory paradigm is just thinking about global warming and how global warming has no one particular cause that led to it. It has tons. The last two theories are definitely my favorite theories. And when I was in graduate school, these were the theories that I focused on. So the first one is called the rhetorical theories. And this is basically, it kind of looks at the way that a message is being said. So in communication studies, when we look at rhetoric, we look at how that message is being, how you're putting out that message and how you take certain like ideas and methods to put that message out there so that it achieves your desired goal. So basically, if you look at commercials, if you look at infomercials, if you look at ads on Instagram, like how are these folks getting you to purchase a product? How are these folks getting you to even think about purchasing that product? Obviously, they put a lot of effort into understanding their audience and what are ways that can get the audience to purchase this product. That's what the rhetorical theory focuses on. And basically, it focuses on how do we send like good, effective messages to get the audience to do what we want. A lot of scholars in this rhetorical theories have analyzed particular speeches of scholars like, I know that there was a scholar, I think it was Burke. Kenneth Burke was one of the biggest scholars in rhetorical theories, who kind of like looked at Hitler's speeches and looked at how Hitler was able to get people to do unimaginable things, horrible things. How did he get these folks to do things for him? And it was all in the message that he created and how effective it was at doing so, which again, it's really scary. So again, the strength of rhetorical theories is that it helps us think about how to create effective messages and focuses on what methods we can use to create these effective messages. But one of the weaknesses is that we're focused on how to create an effective message, and we're focused on just one way of creating an effective message, that we obviously forget how other audiences might interpret the same message. For example, there are some, like if we take the example of Kenneth Burke's interpretation of Hitler's speeches, obviously a lot of people bought into it. A lot of people were persuaded by the message, but then there were also others who were repulsed and horrified by it at the same time. So by focusing so much on what made that message effective to some audiences, we forget to think how other audiences looked at it and what caused them to reject the message. Now, the one that I focused the most on when I was in graduate school was the critical theories approach. And this one is basically, it looks at already theories that have been put into practice, behaviors that have already been put into practice, systems of power structures and all of that. And it looks at how do we challenge these things to create change. So that's what it focuses on. And, when I was in graduate school, this was kind of like the area that I focused on, because I always like to challenge, stereotypes when it came to women of Latinx background and all of that, because that is my background as well. So I focused on all of that, and I did a lot of research and, how can we change these stereotypes? How can we change the way that other groups view Latinx women, or how they just view women in general, or Latinx immigrants, right? And the cool thing about critical research theory is that you kind of look at the theories, you look at kind of like the research that has already been put into place, and you apply it to a real life event. So obviously there have tons of books that have been written about racial stereotypes and, things out there, but you're actually able to apply it to television shows, music videos, movies, books that have been written, and you are able to kind of create that connection between theory and practice. However, because it's very interpretive, it focuses on social values. So it's not as, I don't want to say scientific because it makes it sound like it's not valuable. It totally is. Each one of these paradigms that we have discussed is valuable. They just offer different perspectives. But obviously it's not like the empirical laws paradigm that focuses more on predicting a behavior. The way that we interpret the objects or the artifacts that we're looking at definitely depends on our social values, right? Obviously, the way that a particular society views a group of people is different from another society. So it does depend on those social values. But the reason why I was so passionate about this particular, and I would consider this one as the paradigm of communication studies that I would fall into if I was a scholar doing research on this. The reason why it's because I think there's a lot of power in being able to look at the system that we currently have and wanting to create that change. So again, every single one of these paradigms, like I mentioned, does offer a different perspective, and they're usually used for different areas in communication studies. Some of them are more used for persuasion, mass communication. Others are used for critical race, gender theory. Others are used for interpersonal communication theory perspectives. So depending on what the theory is and what the purpose is, in what field it falls into communication studies, that's the theory that's going to be more effective and more conducive of the results that you're looking at. So when you're researching your communication theory for the paper, start asking yourself, what paradigm does this fit into? Is this an empirical law paradigm? Is this a rhetorical theory paradigm? What does it fit into? Next, Let's talk about interpersonal communication. In chapter 9, we give you like a little bit of background of what interpersonal communication is. Obviously, there is an interpersonal communication class at Santa Monica College that you can take, where we spend an entire semester just diving into interpersonal communication. This particular section of the class, we're just giving you kind of like a little taste of what interpersonal communication is. So let's talk about what is interpersonal communication. So when we talk about interpersonal communication, we're often talking about a relationship between two people, or what is called a dyad. So every single relationship that we examine in interpersonal communication is always between two people. And the definition that we are going to use this semester when it comes to interpersonal communication is the process of exchange where there is a desire or motivation on the part of those involved to get to know each other. So basically, it is a process. So that means that it takes time, right? It's not something that happens magically, right? As you know, when you snap your fingers, it's a process. And in order for this process to take place, there has to be an exchange. So I give you information about myself, you give me information about ourselves. We exchange this information amongst each other. We create an identity of a relationship that is unique to you and I. And in order for this to evolve in an interpersonal relationship, and in order for it to be an interpersonal communication relationship, is that we both have to have the desire, and we have to have some type of motivation to bring us together to get to know each other, whether that motivation be friendship, whether that motivation be love, whether that motivation be working in the same place. All of that can be a motivation. So relationships that we examine when it comes to interpersonal communications are a relationship between an employer and employee, parent and child, siblings, significant other, friends, right? We often look at these relationships as interpersonal communication. And one of the main things that we discuss in interpersonal communications is the process of self-disclosure. So I don't know about you, but sometimes there are people who you can be friends with them for a long period of time, but you know very little about them. And there are people who tell you their entire life story within the first few minutes that you meet them. And depending on who you are and how you view self-disclosure, those interactions are going to seem completely normal or completely strange to you all. So when it comes to self-disclosure, we're looking at that process of kind of like revealing your personal information about yourself to others. And this information has to be information that is not readily available to them. So for example, if you were to meet me and see me, it has to be something that you cannot visibly see upon first interaction, right? It has to be something that takes time. And self-disclosure falls into the social penetration theory. And I know it sounds a little bit odd, but when it comes to social penetration theory, it kind of refers to people to a person as a person that has multiple layers. So if you have ever looked at an onion, when you chop an onion in half and you look at it, it has like different layers to the onion, right? So that's how kind of like it defines people. Each person is kind of like an onion. It has different layers. And at the very beginning, when you are at the very top layers, or when you're getting to know somebody at the very beginning, you're at the top layers of the onion. So the information that you get is very superficial information. So we talk about things like the weather, how are you feeling? What did you do this weekend? Like very superficial, small talk type of topics. And we keep our answers very, very limited, right? We talk about very limited topics. We keep our answers very superficial. And if each of you if you want to get to know the person, you want to get deeper into that relationship, you start peeling those layers of the onion, and you start talking about way more information, way more topics, and you start going into a lot more depth. And that's why we refer to self-disclosure or the social penetration theory as the onion theory, because it takes time to peel those layers of that onion and to get to the core of a person And you might not even get to the core of that person ever, because as human beings, we're constantly changing, we're constantly adding new layers to the onion. So you might never get to the center of a person. And that's okay, because we are changing as humans, but that's the process of self-disclosure. Again, there is not a particular timeline of how self-disclosure works. It just depends on the person and the relationship. And usually there is a process where, you kind of like withdraw. You withdraw from the person and you start kind of like going from those deep topics, going backwards, right, into like a more superficial, limited area of topics that you discuss. So hopefully this lecture has been really helpful for you all. I really enjoyed putting together these slides for you, and hopefully it has helped you understand the topic a little bit better. Make sure that you read chapters 6, 8, and 9. Read them fully, because like I said on the lectures, I only kind of like give you the major information that I think I want you to focus on, and that might be a little bit more difficult to understand, but you are required to read all those chapters completely to take the quizzes and to do well in the course. If you have any questions, join me for my Zoom office hours or shoot me an email, and I will see you all next week.